Hashirama Senju is one of the strongest characters in the history of Naruto. Stated to have been peerless in his time, this absolute mutant had power so great that he could subdue all of the bijuu, beat the brakes off of Madara, and even just his cells function as their own power system, to the point of massively amplifying those who have it grafted onto their bodies. While most people in the Naruto community do agree that Hashirama's a monster worthy of his God of Shinobi moniker, I actually think he tends to be a bit underrated. So in this video, I'll be debunking some common misconceptions and giving you a fresh take covered by nobody on YouTube thus far, with new pieces of evidence you are certainly not aware of, in order to provide you with a definitive answer as to just how powerful the first Hokage truly was. In other words, today we'll be exploring and breaking down why Hashirama is way stronger than you think. To begin this video, I think it's first worth covering the misconceptions that people have had for a while to suggest a lower tier of power for Hashirama, which isn't really something other creators have done. Now, no hate towards those who have made Hashirama scaling videos before, but it tends to be the same redundant, overly saturated garbage that just gets recycled and regurgitated into your brains like a rhetorical mama bird feeding her babies. That's not what you're going to be receiving today. You're on Sage's channel. No regurgitation, just a nuanced, fresh perspective based on information you definitely haven't heard before on the power of the God of Shinobi. But with that out of the way, let's start with the supposed relativity to Madara. This is just blatantly not the case. First of all, Hashirama did just beat Madara 3 separate times in canon, with the only L he took being because Madara already had a win con in place prior to their battle, with Hashirama having Rinnegan rods planted in his back from their previous fight, which allowed Madara to restrain him with his chakra, preventing Hashirama from moving. In the previous 3 rounds, the first one ended with Hashirama beating Madara so badly that Madara is left lying on the ground after a day, while Hashirama is perfectly fine. The second is the final valley, where Madara seeks out the Nine Tails to fight Hashirama with him, since he couldn't do it himself, with Hashirama perfectly handling Madara, even with Kurama's assistance, while in base. Hashirama's official birthday column tells us directly that while in base, Hashirama fought evenly with Madara, even while he's using the full Nine Tails to help. Keep in mind, Hashirama is definitively not trying to kill Madara, with him stating as much, and this is important because the Boruto novels tell us that fighting someone without using killing intent makes a shinobi significantly less effective than they'd normally be, doing less damage than they normally would, and even receiving more recoil from their own attacks. And by the way, just to clarify, we do know this statement is in reference to base Hashirama only, since the next statement in the column tells us that after this, realizing he can't get through to Madara, he then powers up into Sage mode to achieve greater power. What this establishes is that Hashirama is a 9 Tails level gap above Madara at bare minimum, since, again, holding back. This is actually supported by the fact that he uses the golem in base, and this same golem is stated to be equal to Kurama, with the same golem being able to box with and even defeat Madara Susanoo during the war arc, which we'll get into in a sec. Once he does go into Sage mode though, Hashirama just beats the brakes off of the majestic attire Susanoo, ragdolling Kurama like an infant and putting him to sleep like the good little baby fox he is. This battle ends with Hashirama finally getting his resolve and putting a sword through Madara's back, defeating him. In their third battle, as I said before, Hashirama boxes with a perfect Susanoo using his wood golem and ultimately defeats Madara, pinning him down with the deity gates, sealing his movements. This is actually quite impressive considering the fact that they should both have a similar nerf by virtue of them both being Edos, but Madara is actually amped beyond what he would have otherwise been due to having access to his Rinnegan, which he only unlocked later in life, as well as Hashirama's mutant cells, which were grafted onto his chest and granted him access to wood release. So I think this definitively showcases that Hashirama was 100% above Madara by a significant degree, which again is backed up by the fact that he's stated to have been peerless in his time. I'm honestly not sure why this Madara to Hashirama relativity narrative still lives on in the big 2025, but you know, here we are. Another false ceiling placed on Hashirama in this series is Juubito. Now buckle in because I'm about to open your third eye's fourth eye and enlighten you as to why this common misconception is just that. A misconception. Where people get the idea from that Hashirama is below Juubito is the fight between Juubito and the 4 Hokage. When Hashirama arrives, he does just say, "This guy is even stronger than me." Pretty straightforward, right? No, there are a few issues with this. First, this is not the main Hashirama body. This is a wood clone. This is important because wood clones are shown to be weaker than the original. We see this at the end of chapter 636 when Madara is casually taking down multiple wood clones, saying that they offer no resistance, despite the fact that the main Hashirama body is able to defeat this Madara in a 1v1 fight right after this. Now, some will say that this doesn't matter because Hashirama's clone could be referring to the main body when he says this, but that doesn't make any sense for one big reason. These clones refer to themselves in the first person consistently in ways that can only really refer to the individual clones, not the main body. For example, one of the clones who's on a completely different side of the battlefield than the main body tells the shinobi around him not to fear because I am with you. The main Hashirama body is not with those shinobi. He's fighting Madara. So the idea that this is in reference to the main body is nonsensical. Some have also argued that these clones have a shared consciousness due to them being able to telepathically communicate, but this just isn't the case. They can telepathically communicate, but that does not mean that they have a shared consciousness, and we actually get evidence to suggest otherwise. When Yamato is with Team 7 in pursuit of Sasuke, he directly tells them that he's in communication with his wood clone. Why would he need to communicate with the clones if they have a shared consciousness? That doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is that they have a telepathic link, and much like Charles Xavier doesn't have a shared consciousness with Nightcrawler just because he can telepathically communicate with him, the telepathic link here also does not suggest a shared consciousness. So, since there's no other evidence to suggest that they have a shared consciousness, all we can get from this is that they have telepathy, which means that there's no grounds for saying that this clone was actually referring to the main body, at least from this. Something else that people will point out here is that Tobirama agrees with the clone, even saying, even if you reabsorb your other clones, you'd be no match. That seems pretty clear-cut as well, right? Wrong. That, my friends, is a blatant mistranslation. I ran this past my translators, Ood and Hobbs, both of whom speak and read Japanese, as well as through 6 different AI translation programs, and every single time, what it came out to was something along the lines of, even if you send a diminished clone, you won't be a match, brother. So, all we really get from this, from the source material itself, is that a diminished wood clone won't be enough to face down Juubito. Duh. What this actually helps is it makes the line when Hashirama realizes what's going on and goes to help, saying, at this point I need to ... make a lot more sense. If a wood clone would make no difference, much less a diminished wood clone, and the real body is massively above said clone, going to help actually makes a ton of sense if he can be useful, which the clone cannot. If Tobirama is saying that even the main body won't make a difference, this doesn't make any sense. Something else that supports this is the fact that Edo Madara implies that he needs to get Hashirama's Sage Mode from him in order to go face off with Juubito and steal the Juubi from him. Now, you could just say that he doesn't really know how his own strength compares to Juubito's, but the fact that he's willing to admit inferiority to Hashirama just shows that he's A, probably got a good grasp for how his power compares to others, and B, if he were just weaker than Juubito even with the Sage Mode, to the point of being unable to defeat him, he wouldn't have any hesitation about expressing that. The fact that he thought acquiring Hashirama's Sage Mode would allow for him to be able to take on the likes of Juubito and win, with Hashirama being above said Edo Madara, leads me to believe that this at least is a conversation to be had, which fits far more neatly with my interpretation of these events, as I've laid them out, than it would with the common misconceptions that I addressed prior. It also fits better with the fact that Orochimaru implies CM2 EMS Sasuke, who's relative to BSM Naruto, still has yet to surpass Madara, who's below Hashirama by a 9 tails level gap. That places Hashirama firmly above the likes of BSM Naruto by at least a 9 tails level gap, who could at least somewhat contend with the likes of Juubito. Some people believe that this statement from Oro is in reference to Edo Madara, but I don't really think so, simply because we don't actually know that he's seen Edo Madara on the battlefield at this point. I think it makes more sense for him to be making this claim based on his findings about alive Madara, which would offer even greater stock here, since Madara is stated to be regaining his former strength upon being revived and taking Hashirama's Sage Mode from him, making this alive EMS Madara superior to his Edo counterpart. But that being said, what this does for Hashirama is it puts him again at least a 9 tails plus level gap above BSM Naruto, which is pretty crazy. That said, I think that what I've laid out makes the most sense and fits together more perfectly than any of the misconceptions we've talked about, and I feel I've explained why Hashirama is certainly not a Madara rival, nor is he verifiably below Juubito, despite both of these things being very common misconceptions in the community. However, that does beg the question, just how strong is the God of Shinobi really? Well, before we dig into that, if you're enjoying the video so far, have learned something, or just aren't a terrorist, make sure to like and subscribe. Much love and appreciation in advance for my fellow non-terrorists. So then, if Hashirama isn't a Madara rival and isn't verifiably below Juubito, that leaves us in a weird, ambiguous space where we don't really know how strong he is, we just know how weak he's not. We do know he's at least a 9 tails level gap above BSM Naruto, but by how much? What actually is the upper limit of his power? Before we dig into this, I'll preface this by saying I intentionally delayed this video in order to run this argument past dozens of people in the community and dig through the material myself in search of a valid counter-argument for it. There were none. So what I'll do here is lay out the argument, go through the popular attempted debunks I've heard, and leave the rest to you. Follow me here. Databook 4 outright calls Hashirama the strongest shinobi, with the Raws actually emphasizing that this is a fact, using kanji that describes it as so. This is important because Databook 4 covers through chapter 691, or the end of the Kaguya fight. My initial inclination for this statement was maybe this is in regards to while he was alive, but the problem is that this is a present tense statement using present tense language, and we have numerous examples to showcase that when past tense statements are made, past tense language is used, or at bare minimum, there's something on the page to indicate it, like the paneling being referenced. That's not the case here for either of those things, so it's definitely in present tense. My second inclination was that maybe it's in reference to non-Six Paths characters. That also can't be true though, since the Night Guy Databook page specifically calls Juubito the strongest shinobi, in reference to that time, meaning that Six Paths characters, even in the very same databook, are considered shinobi. Some might also say that this could just be flowery or hyperbolic language, but since the databooks are expository reference texts, with the majority of the information being factual, such as dates, ages, ninja registration numbers, jutsu names, ranks, etc., this makes any individual statement more likely to be factual than not, by virtue of how these types of texts are written. Something that helps this also is that one of the rules of using hyperbole or figurative speech in expository writing is that it should be used sparingly, and when it is used, it should be obvious and not misleading. Due to the fact that, again, any given statement in the databooks is more likely to be inherently factual by the text's very nature, and there's nothing that makes this obviously hyperbolic, it's unlikely to be the case that this is hyperbole or flowery language. So what we're left with here is Hashirama, up to chapter 691, in some capacity, is in fact the strongest shinobi. If that's the case, it's my job to try and explain why this works, and I think the following argument makes the most sense. Since we've established that base Hashirama is a 9 tails plus level gap above EMS Madara, we can then extrapolate from there what it would look like if certain things fell into place for Hashirama like they did for Madara. So, Madara gets revived, gains his Hashirama cells, and gets his Rinnegan. Those same 2 Rinnegan were not enough for Pain to overcome even half of the 9 tails, which is at least half as weak as the full 9 tails. So this means to me that those 2 eyes together don't necessarily make up a full 9 tails level gap, or even a half 9 tails level gap. The same is true for Wood Release. Wood Release struggled to contain even Naruto's half of Kurama, even with the chakra suppression properties offered by Wood Release, so that wouldn't necessarily make up a full 9 tails level gap either, even for Madara, and you could even say it doesn't even make up a half 9 tails level gap. So for the sake of argument, let's just assume that the eyes and Hashirama cells do close that 9 tails level gap between Madara and base Hashirama, which again is generous because we can't even verify that either of them individually close a half 9 tails level gap, okay? What this would mean though is if we accept this, revived Madara with the cells and both Rinnegan would roughly be on the same level of a suppressed, no killing intent base Hashirama. Madara then goes on to get an incomplete 10 tails amp, with this 10 tails lacking part of Yuki and half of Kurama, which grants him 6 paths level powers. So that would then give him an incomplete 10 tails level advantage over base Hashirama. But this is where it gets interesting. Fast forward with me to the final valley, where Naruto and Sasuke are going band for band completely relative to one another, until Sasuke uses his own version of an incomplete 10 tails, basically the same one that Madara had, to power up, beat down Naruto, and ultimately form his Indra's arrow technique. The reason I say this is like an incomplete 10 tails level amp is because he's stated to be doing the exact opposite of what Hagoromo did, with what Hagoromo did being separating the Ten Tails chakra into 9 parts. This means that Sasuke is recombining them in the exact opposite way, which should remake the Juubito chakra, with Sasuke also missing half of Kurama here as well as that same chunk of Yuki. It's also worth noting that Kurama does just say he's using all of their chakra for this, and while Sasuke does try to access more later on, you could just say that it recharges, but he does seem to be using at least a large chunk of what these bijuu altogether would have to offer, which again leads me to believe that this is similar to Madara's baby Ten Tails amp. But then after this, Kurama is capable of matching that amp. How, class? That's right, by gathering enough nature energy to power up Naruto to that level. So, what does this mean for Hashirama? You might see where I'm going. If you rewind with me back to the war arc when Naruto shares his chakra with the Shinobi Alliance, Hashirama states that Naruto plus half of Kurama have almost as much chakra as he does. Since Sage Mode functions by gathering nature energy to balance out and mix with your own chakra, and Hashirama has more chakra than half of Kurama, with half of Kurama being the one who gathered that nature energy, it's reasonable to assume that he'd be able to do something similar given enough time, with that something similar here being generating a 10 Tails level amp using nothing but nature energy. If Hashirama can do this, which he should be able to, and if Madara plus Hashirama cells and his Rinnegan close that 9 Tails level gap to get him to base Hashirama's level, this would mean that the God of Shinobi could then close that gap generated by Madara getting the 10 Tails and even retake the lead in the Madara versus Hashirama power-up battle that we've been referencing. Pretty insane. Something else that's worthy of note here is that the golem itself just might be able to gather this energy for him, as it is a full Kurama level threat. And interestingly, we do see the golem sitting atop the Buddha's head, forming what appears to be the same hand symbol that the Toad Sages use to gather nature energy. So I know that Hashirama obviously uses a different hand sign when he does it, but this hand sign is literally only ever used when sages are gathering nature energy, so it's probably what's happening here, and there's no reason why the golem and Hashirama should be limited to literally one hand sign for it. Maybe that hand sign's better, I don't know, but at worst, it could at least be gathering some nature energy for him, potentially sustaining his Sage Mode if nothing else, or like offering him an additional amount of Sage Mode if his Sage Mode runs out, kind of like Naruto's clones. But what all of this together would mean though is that at his peak in this hypothetical state, which he 100% should be able to achieve through the mechanics of the verse with no real contradictions, Hashirama should in fact be the strongest shinobi through chapter 691, at least in terms of raw power output. Some people argue that this doesn't make sense because the fights we see in the series should go differently if this were true. For example, why would he have to fight Madara for an entire day to edge out a victory? Hashirama was holding back. Why would he then have to fight him again with Kurama and go band for band with him until they're both fully exhausted and have all this damage and stuff on him, while Madara seems to be in a little bit better shape than Hashirama there, despite the fact that Hashirama has a healing factor? He doesn't want to kill Madara, as he states, and as soon as he decides to, he does. It's also possible that he only attained this godly level of Sage Mode later on in life, post-Final Valley, so those are two perfectly reasonable explanations for how those fights went. It's also worth noting that, as TG has pointed out before, it's very likely that Hashirama had to fight Kurama more than once during the Valley of the End fight, with Hashirama also not wanting to kill Kurama, but rather subdue him. We know that he wants to subdue him and capture him because he literally did that with all of the tailed beasts. So, to put this in perspective, a holding back Hashirama had to fight Madara plus a creature likened to a natural disaster capable of taking on 6 bijuu at once while at half power, also stated to be able to turn the planet to ash over and over again like a boss fight round where the boss has multiple lives. And again, despite holding back and having to run the fade against Madara and Kurama repeatedly, Hashirama still stood victorious. And this is incredibly impressive because he didn't tap into that form. Why? Because he didn't have to. But what about his fights in the war? Why doesn't he do it then? Well, he's nerfed. Yes, the Edos are stated to have been brought back near their previous power, but A, how near are we talking? And B, what exactly does this mean? Does this mean near to their previous physical stats, jutsu potency, something else? I mean, Hashirama is just able to fight Kurama with Madara's Susanoo using the golem in base while alive, but has to fight the perfect Susanoo and no Kurama with the same wood golem in Sage Mode during the war. Fishy. right? Madara also recognized that Hashirama and Tobirama couldn't reach their full power, meaning that this difference in their power from the Edo nerf wasn't negligible to the point of being unrecognizable or insignificant. It's both noticeable and significant based on Madara's statement I just mentioned, as well as the discrepancy in how Hashirama has to fight Madara and how their fights go. Also, why doesn't Hashirama ever use the Buddha statue in his fight against Madara or the Ten Tails as an Edo? Pretty weird as well, right? I mean, we know that Tobirama and Minato can just move all of the shinobi away from the battlefield, so it's not like he'd have to worry about collateral damage. I think all of this points to the idea that when they're brought back near their former strength physically, and they have access to probably the primary jutsu and stuff like that, but not necessarily brought back fully in terms of their higher end arsenals. And this nerf could also be more significant for stronger characters like Hashirama, as the strength of the user might limit how strong the Edos can be. Something else that my boy Virtue actually pointed out to me is that it's reasonable to assume Hashirama could be suffering from a greater nerf than the other Hokage due to the fact that the Zetsu bodies, which are used to bring back the Hokage, are stated to be genetic clones of Hashirama. So you could argue that the other Hokage were revived while receiving an additional advantage due to this, while Hashirama is just being revived in a body made of his own cells, which obviously wouldn't make him any stronger than he otherwise should be with his own physiology, whereas the same thing wouldn't be said for the other Hokage. We know that Hashirama's mutant cells amp everyone they come in contact with, so long as their bodies can handle it, with the power from these cells being so strong that it literally overrides the DNA of people who can't handle them, with the only other example of something like that being the Otsutsuki, so wild. But even Orochimaru receives a jutsu potency amp via possessing a Zetsu body. So this should actually make a ton of sense, as the vessels for the Edos themselves could affect the strength of said Edos, with Hashirama not receiving anything additional from this, while the other Hokage do. It's also worth noting that he and Tobirama actually might have received slightly defective Zetsu bodies, more so than Minato and Hiruzen did, as their Zetsu bodies literally are missing parts of their limbs. So do what you want with that, but I thought that was interesting. People might also ask how this could possibly be the case if Hiruzen was stronger than Hashirama. Well, he wasn't. The scam that's been floating around for years calling him the strongest Hokage is a mistranslation. It actually says he's revered as the strongest Hokage. It's a reputation statement perpetrated by those who don't know how strong Hashirama was. We know this because Kabuto tells us directly that everyone who heard of the first Hokage's power considered it to be fairy tale, alongside the Sage of Six Paths, a dude people weren't even convinced existed. So basically, these people making the claim in Konoha or wherever, including Iruka, that Hiruzen was stronger than Hashirama, don't know what the fuck they're talking about. So at the end of the day, the statement is the statement, and I think I've done a good job of backing it up and showing why it actually works in the series. As to why we never saw this hypothetical ultimate form, well, we did, we saw it with Naruto, but with Hashirama, we never had to see it when he likely had access to it, since it wasn't required against anyone he fought, and when it would have been useful, like in the war, he likely couldn't pull it off due to being nerfed. So the idea that I have from this statement, and what I think makes the most sense, is if you take a hypothetical peak power Hashirama, maximum Buddha statue, full nature absorbed like what Kurama did, he could just stand at the peak of the Shinobi world in terms of overall output, and with him accessing Sage Mode, he is able to fight Ten Tails level characters, as they're not invulnerable to it like they are to ninjutsu. Now, that doesn't mean that he beats everybody, but he should be able to at least contend with people on this tier outside of just getting blitzed or, being overwhelmed by hacks. But this video was brought up and written because of that statement, because I found it to be incredibly interesting, and I wanted to give you my best guess as to what it could mean. But in closing, I think that we can all recognize, despite being the strongest, we sadly never got to see Hashirama at his strongest. Mostly because he never had to be. I guess that's fitting for a man who stood head and shoulders above the ninja world, one who deservingly bears the title, God of Shinobi.